My daughter booked a flight from Calgary to Cebu without telling me she was coming. When she and my son arrived at my door on a Wednesday evening in October, Amy didn't hug me first. She looked at the way I was walking and said, "Dad, what happened to your foot?" Sean was already looking past me into the apartment. They had both taken time off work, bought full-price tickets, and flown more than 14 hours because they believed something was wrong and I hadn't told them what it was. They weren't entirely wrong about that. On their second night in Cebu, Amy placed my Canadian passport on the kitchen table. She said they had found a seat on their return flight in 4 days. She said she thought it was time to come home. She used the word home the way people use it when they want you to understand there is only one possible. I looked at my passport and then at my children and told them I wasn't going. I had 4 days to show them why. My name is Victor. I was 63 years old when I left Calgary, recently retired and recently widowed. Jean had been gone for 2.5 years. We were married for 34. After Jean died, Amy called every day for the first few months. My son Sean flew in from Vancouver twice that first winter and drove me to appointments and made sure the fridge had food in it. He organized things. Amy helped me sort through Jean's belongings so I didn't have to do it alone. They were good to me. They still are. But grief doesn't run on a schedule that matches anyone else's calendar. And at some point the daily calls became weekly calls, and Sean's visits became something we talked about rather than something that happened. That isn't a criticism. They had mortgages and children and careers. They had lives that didn't pause. I had a paid-off house in Varsity, a reasonable income between my company pension and my CPP and OAS, and absolutely nowhere to be. Most mornings I was awake before 6. I made coffee and turned on the news because the house was too quiet without it. In January, the temperature dropped to -28 for 11 straight days, and I didn't leave except to clear the walk. I could go 4 or 5 days without a real conversation. Not because no one cared, because everyone had already asked how I was doing, and I had already said fine. Amy and Sean could see the house was clean, and the bills were paid, and the car was in the driveway. From the outside, I looked fine. They couldn't see me driving to Chinook Center on a Saturday afternoon and walking through the mall for an hour, because the mall had people in it, and the house didn't. Moving to the Philippines wasn't something I decided in an afternoon. Jean and I had talked about retiring somewhere warm. We never got to do it. After she died, I started watching videos about Cebu City, the old churches, the coastline, the markets, the foreigners who had built ordinary lives there. I knew those videos were made by people who wanted to show the best version of things. So I was careful. I kept the house in Calgary and put it with a property management company instead of selling it. I set aside emergency savings in a Canadian account I intended to leave untouched. I found a furnished apartment near Colon Street and paid only the first month's rent before arriving. I told my children I was going to try something while I was still healthy enough to try it. I said I wasn't disappearing. I was just moving the radius. Amy cried when I told her. Sean asked whether there was a woman involved. There wasn't, and that answer seemed to worry him more than a yes would have. He could understand a man acting foolish over someone. What he couldn't understand was why his father would leave a comfortable life in Calgary, without a reason that made sense. I couldn't explain it simply enough to fit into a phone call. I wasn't running toward something. I was trying to find out whether there was still a version of myself that existed outside the house where John and I had lived for 26 years. The first weeks in Cebu were disorienting in the specific way that new places always are. The traffic moved according to its own logic, and I had to learn it the hard way. The heat was serious and constant, and I underestimated it every single day for the first month. Grocery shopping took twice as long because I didn't know where anything was. But disorienting isn't the same as bad. For the first time in 2 years, I was paying attention to the world around me. I wasn't moving through familiar rooms in a familiar house waiting for the day to end. I started walking in the mornings along the waterfront near my apartment. After a few weeks, the man who sold fresh coconut juice from a cart near the corner began nodding when he saw me coming. By my second month, he knew how I liked it. That might sound like nothing, but when you've spent a year and a half feeling like furniture in your own life, having someone notice whether you showed up matters more than you'd expect. The person who changed things most was a man named Nestor. He was a retired secondary school principal, a few years older than me, and his English was precise in the way that people who have spent decades teaching it tend to speak. We met at a small cafe near the old fort, and for the first few weeks our conversations were polite and occasional. Then one morning we ended up talking for 3 hours about what it actually felt like to grow old in a country that had decided old people should be managed rather than included. After that, we started walking together most mornings. His wife Perla joined us on weekends. She was warm in the way some people are without trying. The kind of person who made sure there was always extra food and never let anyone leave her table while they were still hungry. Nestor and Perla began including me in small things. Sunday lunches, a nephew's graduation celebration, a neighborhood fiesta that lasted all afternoon and spilled into the evening. Their grown children were around most weekends and they absorbed me into those afternoons without ceremony. To me, that was friendship. From 8,000 kilometers away, my children were beginning to see something else. I was calling Amy and Sean less often than when I had been alone in Calgary. I thought that was a good sign. They thought it was evidence of a problem. When Amy asked how I was doing, I told her I was busy. When Sean called on a Sunday and I let it go to voicemail, it was because Nestor and I were watching a basketball game in the neighborhood and I forgot to check my phone. I didn't explain that. I just called him back the next morning and said I had missed it. Then I made a mistake that was entirely my own. In September, I attended a fiesta where Nestor's sister lived. Someone filmed part of it, people dancing, food everywhere, children running between the tables. I appeared in about 40 seconds of that video, dancing badly with Nestor's nephews, while a woman I had met twice handed me a bottle of Red Horse and laughed at my footwork. The video ended up on Facebook. Nestor's daughter tagged him in it. He shared it. Amy found it 3 days later. She called immediately. She asked who the people were. I explained. She asked how often I spent time with them. I said often. She asked whether I had given anyone money or whether anyone had asked me for anything. I told her they hadn't. She asked whether I was certain. I told her I had managed my own money since before she was born, and I did not appreciate the question. She apologized, but the conversation left something behind that didn't go away. After that, I started sharing less. Not intentionally at first, but after the third time Amy asked whether Nestor and Perla had asked me for anything, I stopped mentioning them. I stopped mentioning a lot of things. When I twisted my ankle stepping off a curb in October, I told Amy I had been resting at home, which was true but incomplete. Nestor had driven me to a clinic. A doctor examined me, confirmed nothing was broken, and gave me something for the swelling. I kept the cane out of the frame on our next video call. I positioned the camera so Amy could only see my face and the bookcase behind me. None of those things were crises, but every detail I left out made the picture my children were assembling in Canada look worse. They knew something had changed. They just didn't know what, so they began filling in the silence with their own answers. Amy and Sean arrived on a Wednesday evening. I expected some awkwardness and then dinner. Instead, Amy noticed my foot before she sat down. She asked about it before she took off her shoes. I told her it was almost healed. She asked why I hadn't mentioned it. I explained that nothing was broken, and I hadn't wanted to worry them unnecessarily. She said she would rather be worried and informed than calm and in the dark. Sean was already moving through the apartment, checking the locks on the windows, and the height of the step from the bathroom into the hallway. Within an hour, Amy had cataloged 3 things she considered unsafe: the step between the bathroom and the hallway, The outside staircase with no railing on one side, the absence of a smoke detector. I pointed out that I had been navigating all of those things for 8 months without incident. She said that was not the same as them being safe. Then the power went out. It happens sometimes in the neighborhood, usually back within 90 minutes. I went to the cabinet where I kept my rechargeable lanterns, set one on the table, and kept talking as if it were nothing. I thought being prepared would reassure them. Sean said, "How often does this happen, Dad?" I said occasionally. He took out his phone and wrote something down. Amy stood in the middle of the dark apartment and said she had already seen enough to know she had been right to come. That was less than 3 hours after they had arrived. The following evening, Perla knocked at my door. I was in the kitchen and called out that it was open. Nestor and Perla had a key I'd given them after I was sick in July, and Nestor had come to check on me and couldn't get inside. Perla entered carrying 2 large containers of food. She knew my children were visiting and had cooked enough for all of us. Amy had her eyes on the key in Perla's hand before Perla had even finished saying hello. After Perla left, Amy asked who had given her a key to the apartment, I explained. She asked whether Perla had ever come in when I wasn't home. I said no. Sean asked whether I was certain. The same question, the same word. The one that made me feel like a man being cross-examined inside his own home. I told them Nestor and Perla had done more for me in 8 months than any of my neighbors in Calgary had done in 8 years. Amy said she knew I believed that, and it was exactly what concerned her. She said they had known me for 8 months. She said they were not my family. I knew she was trying to protect me, but those words landed harder than she meant them to. Because the people she was dismissing had sat with me at the clinic when my ankle was swollen, and I didn't know which jeepney to take. They had brought food when I had a stomach illness in June, and refused the money I tried to give them. They had sent a message to check on me when I missed our morning walk. That is not nothing. My children loved me from 8,000 kilometers away, and I never doubted that love. But love at that distance does not warm the apartment, or notice when you are walking with a limp. We ate Perla's food in uncomfortable silence, while a rechargeable lantern sat between us on the table. The next morning, Amy set my passport on the kitchen table. She told me they had a seat for me on their return flight, leaving Saturday. She said she wanted me to come home. She said it carefully, the way you say something to a person you're not sure will hear it right. I told her I wasn't going. Sean stood up and walked onto the balcony. Amy stayed at the table. She asked whether I understood what I was choosing. I told her I understood it completely. For the first time since Jean died, I had a reason to leave the apartment every morning. I had people who expected to see me. I was walking more and eating better and sleeping through the night. Going back to Calgary would give my children peace of mind. It would also return me to the house where I had spent 18 months watching time move without me in it. Amy said I could move to Vancouver. I could be near Sean and see the grandchildren more. I could join a seniors group, have Sunday dinners, be included. It sounded wonderful. It also sounded like a schedule someone else would manage and quietly let lapse when life got busy. I didn't want to become the obligation my children rearranged their weekends to accommodate. I wanted a life that continued after the phone call ended. Amy looked at me as though I had accused her of something. I hadn't. I just couldn't find a gentler way to say a true thing. Sean came back inside and proposed something I hadn't expected. He said they would stop asking me to leave for 3 days. During those 3 days, I would show them everything. Where I went, who I spent time with, what I spent money on, and what my plan was if something happened to me. After 3 days, we would talk again about the flight. I said I would agree to that, but only if they were willing to admit at the end that they might have been wrong about some of it. The next morning I took them to the waterfront. We walked the route I walked every day. The man with the coconut cart waved. The woman who ran the small breakfast place near the old church called out my name before I reached the door and asked why I was late. Amy looked at me differently after that. Not convinced yet, just quieter. Nestor met us for coffee and answered every question Sean asked, directly and without defensiveness. He explained how we met, how often we spent time together, what had happened the afternoon my ankle gave out. He confirmed that I had paid my own clinic bill, and that neither he nor Perla had ever asked me for anything. He told Sean that if his own father lived far away, he would ask the same questions. Sean looked slightly embarrassed. Nestor wasn't bothered. He said, "I would want to know too." That answer shifted something in the room that I hadn't been able to move myself. Later, I took them through the rest of my normal week, the pharmacy where the staff knew which prescription I was refilling, the clinic where the doctor remembered my file from the ankle visit, the market where I'd learned enough of the local language to get the pronunciation mostly right before people started laughing. By lunchtime, Sean had stopped scanning doorways for problems I was hiding. That afternoon, I opened my laptop and showed them my finances. My combined monthly income from my company pension, CPP, and OAS came to just over $3,200 Canadian. My rent, utilities, food, transportation, and medical expenses in Cebu ran between $1,400 and $1,700 a month. My emergency savings were in a Canadian account that required only my signature. The house in Calgary was managed professionally and depositing rental income back into that same account. No one else had access to any of it. Sean went through the statements carefully. He found nothing unusual. He closed the laptop and said, "Okay, this is actually more organized than I expected." Amy didn't find that as reassuring as he did, because money had never been what frightened her most. That night, she asked what would happen if I fell and couldn't reach my phone. What if something happened suddenly? What if I eventually needed help with things I wasn't yet ready to discuss? I told her I didn't have answers for every possibility. I also hadn't had those answers when I was living alone in Calgary, and no one had flown in to intervene about that. The difference was that in Cebu, someone noticed when I didn't show up for my morning walk. The following morning, I found Amy on the balcony before I had made coffee. She was sitting with her phone in both hands, and she had been crying. I didn't know why until she handed me the phone. Perla had written to her directly, not to me, to Amy the night before without telling me. The message was short. Perla apologized for entering the apartment with a key and explained that she had left it on the table because she never wanted Amy to feel that anyone was trying to take her place. Then she wrote the part my daughter had not been ready for. "Your father talks about you and your brother every time we see him. He is proud of the people you have become. I know you are afraid because you love him. We are not trying to be his family. We only want him to have someone nearby when you cannot be here." Amy handed me the phone, and for a few minutes neither of us spoke. When Jean was dying, Amy had taken weeks off work to help me care for her. She had watched me hold myself together in front of everyone else and then fall apart when I thought no one was looking. After Jean was gone, Amy had carried something I had never asked her to carry. She believed keeping me safe was one of the ways she could still do right by her mother. My decision to move to the Philippines had felt to her, I realized then, like a door closing on that promise. Like I was choosing strangers over the person who had stayed. I sat beside her and told her she had not failed me. I was not in Cebu because she hadn't done enough. I was there because I needed to find out who I was when I wasn't Jean's husband. When I wasn't Amy's father who needed checking on. When I wasn't the grandfather who showed up at Christmas and then drove home to an empty house. I needed something that was mine. She wiped her face and asked whether I was actually happy. It was the first question she had asked since arriving that wasn't designed to find a problem. Yes, I told her, not every day, but more often than I had been. That afternoon, I brought them to something I hadn't mentioned in any of our calls home. Twice a week, I sat with a small group of university students who were preparing for job interviews with hotels and tourism companies that operated in English. It wasn't a paid position. A contact of Nestor's had asked whether I would be willing to talk through things like professional introductions and how to handle a difficult guest. I agreed the first time, because I had nothing else that afternoon. I kept going back, because it turned out I was good at it, and they were generous enough to make me feel that way. Amy and Sean sat at the back of the room while I worked with a group of 7 students. They watched people listen when I spoke. They watched me remember names from the week before, ask follow-up questions, build on what we had covered together. They watched me become useful to someone in a way that had nothing to do with keeping a seat warm at someone else's Sunday dinner. When the session ended, one of the students thanked Amy for letting her father stay in Cebu. Amy smiled and said she didn't think he had been waiting for her permission. It was the first time the two of us had laughed together since they arrived. That evening, Nestor and Perla had all of us to their house for dinner. Nothing was staged. We ate grilled fish and rice, and a dessert I still couldn't name properly. Sean helped Nestor sort through a drawer of cables and parts that had apparently been waiting for someone who actually knew what they were. Amy sat with Perla and went through photograph albums. I sat outside while 2 of Nestor's grandchildren competed to teach me the most Cebuano words before I forgot all of them. Nothing remarkable happened. That was exactly why it worked. My children were not watching a version of my life that had been prepared for an audience. They were watching an ordinary evening in an ordinary week, and they could see that my life had both of those things. On the walk back, Sean admitted that he had come expecting to find a situation his father was too proud to name. He thought he would find financial problems or a man pretending strangers cared about him because he was too embarrassed to come home. Instead, he had found a life that was smaller in some ways than what I'd had in Calgary and fuller in ways he hadn't known how to measure from a distance. Amy said nothing until we reached the building. She stopped at the bottom of the outside staircase and looked at the side without a proper railing. Then she looked at my foot. She said she still thought we needed to fix the staircase situation before she got back on a plane. 3 days earlier, those words would have started another argument. This time her voice sounded different. She wasn't asking me to abandon what I had built. She was asking how we could protect it. We spent that night making a list, a ground floor unit with a better layout, an emergency plan that included Nestor's number alongside Amy's and Sean's, a standing Sunday video call, copies of my medical information sent to Amy's email, a medical alert app on my phone that Sean installed and showed Nestor how to use. For every concern they raised, I tried to find a practical answer rather than a defensive one. That felt different, better. The return flight was Saturday. The seat they had booked for me was still available. On Friday morning, I came downstairs and found Amy at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee. She pushed one across without saying anything. Then she said Sean and I canceled your seat. I thought I had misunderstood her. Sean came in from the hallway and explained. They still wanted me back in Canada someday. They still didn't love the idea of being this far away. They were not going to stop worrying, but they had stopped believing that worrying and protecting were the same thing. They had stopped believing that putting me on a plane was the same as keeping me safe. Amy reached across the table and said, "We came here because we were scared. I think we needed to see that you already had things figured out. You just hadn't let us see enough of it to know." She was right about the second part. I had hidden the ankle and the stomach illness and the power outage because I was tired of being managed. But treating every question as an accusation had left my children filling the silence with their worst guesses. The answer was not to move back to Calgary. The answer was also not to keep pretending everything was flawless. The answer was the list we had made together the night before. Before they left, we finished the work. Nestor helped me start looking at ground floor apartments. Amy put together a folder on her phone with my medical information, insurance documents, emergency contacts, and the number for the Canadian consulate in Cebu. Sean made sure Perla had both his and Amy's numbers and understood how to use the emergency app. I agreed to pick up the Sunday video call even if I was in the middle of something, and I promised to stop shielding my children from the truth. If I got sick, I would tell them. If I fell, I would tell them. And if life in Cebu ever stopped working the way it was working now, I would be the first one to say so. Staying didn't have to mean proving I could never be wrong. At the airport Saturday morning, Amy held on longer than usual. She asked me to send a photo from my walk on Sunday so she could see the waterfront, not as evidence, just because she wanted to. Sean told me he planned to come back in the spring, as a visitor this time, he said, not a rescue team. I watched them go through the security gate and then stood outside the terminal alone. Nestor was waiting in the car park. Perla had sent a message asking what I wanted for dinner on Sunday. The students expected me Tuesday. 8 months earlier, being alone had been something to manage, a condition. That morning outside the terminal, it felt like an ordinary pause before the next part of the day. I was alone for a moment. I was not lonely. Those are two different things, and the distance between them had cost me more than I expected, and given me more than I know how to put into a phone call. 2 weeks later, I moved into a ground-floor apartment 6 minutes from the old one. Better bathroom, no hazardous staircase, enough space for Amy and Sean to stay when they came back. Nestor and Perla still checked on me regularly. The key arrangement was simpler now. A small lockbox near the door with a code that Nestor had, and that my children could pass along to anyone who needed it if I couldn't get to the door myself. Sunday calls became a fixed part of the week. Sometimes Amy stayed on after I signed off to chat with Perla. Sometimes Sean asked Nestor for restaurant recommendations before his spring trip. The two parts of my life had once regarded each other with suspicion across a very wide ocean. They were slowly learning how to share the same map. My children crossed an ocean because they were afraid strangers were replacing them. What they found instead was a community filling the hours that family, through no fault of its own, cannot fill from 8,000 kilometers away. We had all been wrong about something. They hadn't understood the life I was living. I hadn't given them enough of the truth to understand it. The answer was not for me to go back to Calgary. It was also not for me to pretend I had no limits or that nothing here would ever go wrong. The answer was a safer apartment, an honest emergency plan, regular contact, and people nearby who knew when something was off. Getting older means thinking about safety. I understand that now in a way I didn't before Jean died. But being protected and being alive are not the same thing, and I spent too long in Calgary being very well protected and barely alive at all. My children came to Cebu to bring me home. In the end, they did exactly that. They just had to come all this way to see that home had already moved.